Good morning. Happy Sunday. Got my neuro coffee here. So we are ready to rock and roll for a little bit of week in review and some Q&A. It was a big week. The Padawan came in pretty loaded. He's been asking some really good questions. So we posted a lot of stuff up on YouTube this past week. Some of the discussions were really useful. And so please check those out. Also been busy on Instagram as well, offering up some information and some things there, so hopefully you'll take advantage of those things. Got some really good questions also for the Q&A today. And I'm very busy today with mentorship calls, so we're squeezing this in between a couple of calls. So I'm going to dig right into the Q&A, and we'll get started with that. So this one came in from Instagram. Could you please go over the why for the technique for the suitcase carry, taking big steps and swinging the free arm. So this comes in reference, I believe, to the pain-free powerlifting seminar video that I posted, where we showed a rather good-sized human being, very strong, using a suitcase carry to actually recapture some shoulder range of motion and some hip range of motion. And so the reason that we use that technique, so the large steps and the swinging of the arm, is to make sure that the hip and pelvis and the shoulder girdle that is on the non-loaded side move through the entire excursion of where the inhalation and exhalation moments take place. And so in most cases, especially with big strong people, they have a very strong concentric strategy, because we have to use a lot of high pressure, internal pressures, to lift big heavy things. And so that creates a lot of concentric orientation, a lot of concentric muscle activity that restricts range of motion. By having someone walk and extending their gait to the end and early phases of the propulsive phase, that's where inhalation can actually take place. And so if we emphasize the inhalation, they gain eccentric orientation, which allows them to actually restore their range of motion. And so by exaggerating that to a certain degree, we make sure that they hit the two ends of that inhalation element of the respiratory cycle that's associated with gait. And so again, that's why the carries become so important and so useful, especially for your larger, stronger human beings, because it allows them to capture the inhalation moment that they give up in return for gaining strength. So again, we can use load to help us emphasize elements of a compressive strategy, and then utilize the rest of the body to capture the expansive strategy. So that's why we would cue that in the loaded carries. Next question. So when does a person earn standing with resets? What prereqs are necessary for the standing reset to be successful? So to earn a standing reset, so let's talk about this. So a reset is any activity that you're using to recapture one element of the respiratory cycle, or a concentric to eccentric orientation of the movement system to either enhance or restrict an element of movement, depending on what your goal may be. And if we look at the axial skeleton and the pressures within it, at the very bottom of the axial skeleton, we've got the pelvic floor, the pelvic diaphragm. And so this diaphragm becomes very important as far as the ability to manage the pressures as it catches everything from above it. And so in many cases, especially in a rehab setting, where we might take gravity out of the equation to a certain degree by laying somebody on a table, what we want to assure is that the elements of the ability to expand or compress the volumes inside of the axial skeleton are intact. And so before we stand someone up and force them to manage the gravitational element of controlling the pressures inside the body, we want to make sure that the potential to manage those pressures and volumes are intact. And so what we might do is say, you need to pass this table test. So I need a full excursion of a joint as a representation of the ability to manage those pressures before I stand you up, and now I challenge you to do so against gravity. And so the prerequisites then would be, can you do this in a gravity reduced or gravity eliminated position before I stand you up? So that answers the first part of that question. And then what prerequisites are necessary for a standing reset to be successful? I have to be able to then take that element of gravity upon myself and be able to manage it from the bottom up. So now we're grounded. So we've got a foot on the ground. We have an extremity that has to be able to influence the position of the axial skeleton. So we have a peripheral to central element that also has to be included, because now we've taken gravity and we've applied it. So to be successful in the standing reset, we have to be able to take that foundation from the ground upward. And so now I have to integrate the foot, the lower extremity, the pelvis, and the axial skeleton all at the same time for that standing reset to be successful. So that's a really good question. Number 3, how does your interaction with a patient change as you transition them from being a rehab client to a training client? So this is a really common question, and this would be the difference between whether we're working on recapturing the adaptability of the system versus maybe restricting the adaptability of the system for an element of performance. And so we can look at this as I don't know what element is actually restricting the variability or the adaptability of the system in a rehab setting. So what I have to do is I have to use my proxy measure, which is typically a range of motion, as a determining factor of whether this system has sufficient variability. Because again, I never know what element of the system is the limiting factor in someone's ability to adapt to the stressors of whether it be gravity or life or movement or whatever activity that they want to pursue. And so initially, when we look at them as a rehab client, what we're trying to do is influence the adaptability of the system. And again, I'm using a proxy measure. I have to use my scope of practice that allows me to identify some way to determine whether the system has changed in a favorable way. As we move into training or we move into performance, if I am trying to achieve some specific outcome in regards to performance, run fast, jump high, lift heavy things, whatever it may be, I may have to then reduce the adaptability of some elements of the system in return for an element of performance. Because say that if I'm trying to increase someone's ability to lift heavier things, I know that I'm going to be using a compressive strategy to do so. This might actually eliminate or reduce some elements of that variability that I captured in the rehab setting, and then I just need to monitor for change as to whether this is a favorable change or not. In the general fitness population, what we probably want to be able to do is make sure that they maintain a much more broad element of variability in the system. And so this requires some monitoring on a regular basis. So we would have some sort of key performance indicator that may allow us to determine whether we're actually stealing some of that variability that we want to maintain. So we could use some form of complex movement, whether that be some element of maybe like a toe touch test or a squat variation of some sort that will allow us to again, give us an ongoing representation of how much variability there is in the system and whether we want to sacrifice that in return for an element of performance or maintain that. So again, another very, very good question. Number 4, why is speed always the last thing that we layer onto an activity when we're teaching a new movement? Is there an instant where we'd want to increase speed initially to aid in the learning? I think the reason that you want to limit speed through the early phases of learning comes down to whether we're able to process the element of feedback. So if we're still learning how to manage positions, influence pressures and volumes to achieve a certain body shape that allows us to achieve the goal, we may have to attend to feedback, and that has to be done in a much slower manner to allow us to even process that. Because if it happens too fast, then we don't get the feedback that allows us to know whether we're being successful or not. When we perform faster movements, the sense of feedback occurs in hindsight. So it's after we perform something that we would be able to process this information. So again, if we add speed too soon, we may not be able to process the information and determine whether we're right or wrong, because ultimately what we want is the performer to be able to determine whether they were successful or not on their own. And if we're coaching someone, we want to be able to provide the feedback for them so that they can make a comparison between trials that allows them to determine whether they're being successful or whether they're making the appropriate change. So typically, I think that we're always going to add that element of speed in a later stage of the learning process. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that I would do where speed would be an early intervention in an attempt to learn faster, because again, I think that just from a processing standpoint and the way that we utilize information and feedback, I don't think that adding speed would be a good choice at the beginning. Good questions. These are fun. Let's see. We talked about how learning anatomy in school is difficult without context, but if we can potentially encounter an infinite number of situations, then wouldn't it serve to better learn the principles of anatomy in school? I feel like it's what school attempts to teach, but maybe they just choose the wrong principles to harp on. I just think that learning anything outside of a context becomes very, very difficult because it's rote memorization. If it's not meaningful, you may be able to regurgitate it on a test at some point in time, but if there's no emotion attached to it, if there's not a great deal of attention attached to it, then it makes it very, very difficult to maintain. So one of the things that you notice when a student comes in to the clinical situation is there'll be certain elements that they're able to maintain in regards to their understanding of anatomy, but in general, they tend to forget a lot because, again, it just wasn't useful at the time. If we were to learn regions of anatomy or elements of anatomy within a context of movement. So say that we're performing a squat or a lunge or a bend or a reach or a press or whatever it may be, and then maybe expose ourselves to elements of anatomy as to what is responsible for creating this type of a compressive strategy, or what elements are utilized to influence positions and movement as they occur. I think it becomes much more useful. And again, it becomes much more meaningful as to how these positions are required. Just consider the way that the rear foot would work during pronation to supination. And if we looked at a situation, say moving into and out of a cut where the foot would be positioned with a supination strategy, moving into a propulsive foot, which would be a pronation strategy, and then moving back out of, and then we say, okay, so this is what the foot's doing. This is a visual representation of what's happening. And then maybe we can look at some of the musculature, perhaps, as to what is moving through its concentric to eccentric orientation. And then it becomes very, very useful where we would say, well, this element, like we look at the deep posterior compartment of the lower leg as it supports the sustentaculum tali to influence the calcaneal position, then I think we have something that's really, really interesting, fascinating, and useful. And then we get a much stronger retention of that information versus just looking at the cadaver laying on a slab and pulling on little things and pointing to things and saying, this is that, this is that. I think it becomes much more useful when we can look at things in context. And so I think that that's probably the best way. Because if we're just looking at where things are, just buy yourself a really good anatomy app like Complete Anatomy, and you can carry that with you. And again, information that's easily accessible doesn't need to be memorized at all, because we have so much access to information right now. When it becomes useful is how is this behaving in context, and I think that now we have something that we can utilize much more effectively. So another really, really good question. Yeah, here's another good one. Can you expand upon why the all-four position would compress the space between the shoulder blades instead of expanding? So let's look at you from an evolutionary standpoint. If we look at the all fours position with the hands positioned directly below the shoulders, and if we look at where we are in a propulsive phase, so if I was walking on all fours and the hands directly below the shoulder, that would be mid-propulsion. So that would be the point where I am near maximal in my ability to push against the ground. And to do so, I would have to have a compressive strategy posteriorly on the support side, just for the element of stability to overcome gravity. Otherwise, if it did expand, it would allow movement to occur, and I could potentially collapse. And so when we put somebody in all fours that already has a compressive strategy in the dorsal rostral thorax, all we're doing is reinforcing that. Now, in some cases, there are people that can expand under that circumstance because we're dealing with gradients. There's always elements of loading and propulsion, regardless of what strategy that we're using, and as long as we're in contact with the ground. And so some people can't overcome that. But if we're dealing with somebody that has a very, very strong compressive strategy that has done a great deal of strength training, or has a high level of hypertrophy, then it becomes a question mark as to whether they can overcome that. Now, there are ways to utilize this position. So if I went from a two-arm support to a single-arm support, I have now alleviated some of that compressive strategy on the non-support side. And so now where I compress on one side, I can expand on the other. So now we're back to the earlier question about why we would use the loaded carry. The loaded carry creates compression on one side and allows expansion on the other. And so now we can influence that. But if I'm in a bilateral support and I'm trying to create expansion in that dorsal rostral area, it's probably not the best choice. There are other places where I can expand in this position that may support an element of shoulder girdle mobility, but again, I would question whether you're going to be successful in expanding that dorsal rostral area, which would be from about T2 through T7-ish. So again, hopefully that explains why that might be not the best choice. Again, some people may be successful in that position, but more often than not, you won't be, and you need to choose something else. So I got another question that sort of supports this. In regards to trying to achieve expansion in this area, where someone was using more of a spine flex position and not achieving the expansion in that all fours. So again, some people try to achieve the expansion and they end up driving that spinal flexion instead of the expansion. And so they're looking for suggestions as to how can I alter this. Well, if the hands below the shoulders in all fours is nearly maximal in compression in that area, I need to move the upper extremity into a space where I can achieve an expansion in that area, which is usually above shoulder level or below shoulder level. So just by altering the positions, so that's why bear crawls become so important from a gym classy kind of a standpoint, or even as a warm-up for your athletes, because it does move the upper extremity through the full respiratory excursion of inhalation to exhalation. And so I am capturing the two ends where I can inhale, because as I reach forward in the bear crawl, the arm is above shoulder level, and as I step through in the bear crawl, the arm comes below shoulder level. So at the two ends of that respiratory spectrum now, I have the capacity to inhale, eccentrically orient, and then recapture a great deal of shoulder range of motion. So again, this is one of those reasons why I think we got to bring gym class back in a major way. And instead of spending all of your time with these table assessments that you don't really need to do with a lot of your clients, if you just include elements within their warm-up that address these ends where inhalation is more capable, I think your success rate is going to improve dramatically, and it'll save you a world of time. Instead of trying to turn a training client into a rehab client by throwing them on the table, just warm them up correctly, and I think a lot of good things will happen. So again, when you're dealing with these compressive strategies, especially in the posterior upper back, moving the extremity into a position where inhalation is much more capable is a much more successful strategy. A final question, since we are a little pressed for time today. Is there a correct position of the pelvis relative to the base of support? That would be your feet. that would be considered ideal for a squat. Now, so there's a lot of things that are called squats that probably aren't squats, but ultimately what differentiates a true squat from anything else that would be closer to what would be traditionally referred to as a hinge, it would be the relative position of the ischial tuberosity, so your sit bones, relative to the heels. So the further posterior that the ischial tuberosities are relative to the heel, the more concentrically oriented you're going to see in regards to the pelvic diaphragm. The more internally rotated the strategy will be at the hip, the more exhalation dominant you'll see a strategy. So if we were to say what a powerlifter would call a squat, so a powerlifting style squat, where the shin is relatively vertical and the hips are much more posterior in more of a hinging motion, you're going to be looking at a very, very strong concentrically oriented strategy, a very strong exhalation strategy. So if we were to truly make a reference to that as a squat, it's really a misnomer. It's more of a hinging type of motion because of the strategy involved. What we're looking for in a squat, a true traditional deep sort of an ass to the grass or butt to heels kind of a squat, that is a great representative of the ability to posteriorly, of the posterior aspect of the body to eccentrically orient, expand, and inhale, and allow that pelvic diaphragm to move into an eccentric orientation, and that allows movement to occur. So again, the differentiator in a squat to the hinge would be that relative position to keep the ischial tuberosities over the heels. And so that's why we would use modifications as we're trying to restore such a capacity. That's why the heels elevated position becomes very, very useful, because it biases us towards an eccentric strategy, towards an inhaled position, even though the inhale and the exhale are always occurring at the same time. Because again, we're playing with gradients. It's never one or the other. But if we're trying to bias ourselves towards an inhalation strategy to recapture range of motion and eccentric orientation, we want to keep the ischial tuberosity over the heel. So again, I got to get on another mentorship call here, so I appreciate your time. I appreciate you watching. Pay attention to Instagram this week, and I'll throw up some more stuff on YouTube as we educate the Padawan. So there'll be a lot of good stuff coming down in regards to content. If you have any questions, please post them on Instagram or send them to me at askbillhartman@gmail.com. askbillhartman@gmail.com, and I will see you next week.